Imagine what thriving rural communities look like. Main streets lined with open businesses, schools filled with children, freshly paved roads, fast, reliable internet, clean water and air. Imagine lots of farms of different sizes scattered across the countryside, raising a variety of crops and animals using a variety of farming methods. Imagine a food system that balances the needs of everyone: farmers, workers, processors, distributors, and retailers, while providing nutritious food for every community. These are the kinds of communities most of us want, but in much of rural America, that isn't the reality. After decades of farm loss and generations of young people flocking to the cities, our small towns and villages are in disrepair. The good news is, we can bring our rural communities back to life. It starts with creating a stable and resilient family farm economy. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the key challenge in agriculture was producing enough food to feed everyone. Then came technological advances in equipment, genetics, and chemicals that allowed farmers to squeeze more food out of each acre of land than ever before. These innovations kept coming, and between 1948 and 2015, agriculture production increased by a whopping 170%. On the surface, this seems like a great thing. More food production means more profit for farmers, right? Not exactly. The number of U.S. farms has been in steady decline for nearly a century, dropping from over 6 million in 1935 to just over 2 million today. Many of the farms that remain face mounting debt and lower levels of farm income than ever before. So what happened? The decline in the farm economy was caused in large part by runaway overproduction. These days, overproduction of food is as much of a problem as food scarcity. Every year, nearly 40% of food produced in the U.S. is wasted. Not only is this, wasteful, but it also causes environmental problems: soil erosion, groundwater depletion, landfills spilling over with rotting food, not to mention all the resources it took to produce that food in the first place. Overproduction is also a huge problem for farmers. When farmers produce too much of a commodity like milk, meat, or grains, the price they're paid for that commodity drops. Farmers respond to low prices and the need to regain that income by producing even more food. This floods the market and drives prices down further, forcing farmers to either borrow more money to keep expanding or go out of business altogether. Low prices from the marketplace also make farmers more dependent on government subsidies bankrolled by taxpayers, and the majority of payments are handed to the largest farms who overproduce the most. This has created a cycle that allows the big to continue getting bigger and push out smaller competitors. Other industries slow down production when there's a market surplus, but no individual farmer can stem the flood of surplus commodities. It takes collective action, farmers working together to balance supply and demand in agricultural markets. The concept of balancing food production to meet demand is not new. It was a cornerstone of New Deal-era farm policies that ensured farmers a fair price and helped the economy recover from the Great Depression. They worked by setting minimum prices for commodities based on the average cost of production. Grain reserves and cold storage kept surplus products off the market when prices were low, so they could be sold when prices were high. Land set-asides prevented surpluses and provided conservation benefits. The programs weren't perfect, but for a time, they brought real prosperity to rural America. During the late 20th century, price supports and supply management were slowly dismantled by an agribusiness industry that saw them as a barrier to their growth at all costs business model. These corporate giants benefit from overproduction because it allows them to pay the farmer less and keep more of the profit. They use that wealth to elect politicians who support their agenda: more exports, more production, and more subsidies to keep farmers quiet. In 1996, President Bill Clinton drove the final nail in the coffin when he signed the Freedom to Farm Act, terminating the last vestiges of New Deal supply management. Since then, commodity prices have swung wildly, and farmers have become increasingly dependent on government subsidies. In 2018, after nearly 4 years of low milk prices forced over 7,000 U.S. dairy farms out of business, Wisconsin Farmers Union brought supply management back into the spotlight. They started having conversations with dairy farmers about what it would take to improve prices and save the family dairy farms that were rapidly disappearing. Wisconsin Farmers Union launched the Dairy Together movement and set out to learn what an updated version of supply management could look like for U.S. dairy farmers. The group commissioned 2 dairy economists to research the impact supply management would have on the dairy industry. The results showed that had the program been implemented with the 2014 Farm Bill, it would have increased milk prices, doubled net farm operating income, significantly reduced government expenditures, and kept hundreds of dairy farmers in business. The impact on consumer prices would have been negligible, adding roughly 11 cents to the cost of a gallon of milk. And this is just one example. Imagine if this was applied to all commodities experiencing overproduction. So why don't we have supply management anymore? Because agribusiness corporations convinced farmers and politicians of the following myths. Number 1, an abundance of cheap food would benefit American consumers and reduce hunger. Unfortunately, surplus food doesn't equate to feeding more people. Remember these? These days, hunger is caused by poverty, not by food scarcity. So even though there's plenty of food on supermarket shelves, people go hungry because wages haven't kept pace with inflation. Some of the very same food processing and retail companies who are paying farmers so little also pay workers so little that they can't afford to feed their families. Myth number 2. Supply management is incompatible with feeding the world through exports. In reality, farmers and local food systems all over the world have been displaced by a flood of cheap commodities, contributing to poverty and food insecurity. It was never about feeding the world. It has always been about padding the pockets of the agribusiness industry. If we want to make sure the world is fed, our trade agreements must include fair wages for workers and pro-farmer policies like supply management. Myth number 3. Supply management means big government controlling farmers and our food supply. The truth? Farmers have become more dependent on government subsidies since the 1970s. Getting a fair price from the marketplace by balancing supply with demand actually makes farmers less dependent on the government. Rather than relying on taxpayers to bail farmers out when the market is flooded, we need Congress to create a program that prevents farmers from flooding the market in the first place. All these myths are just a smokescreen for the real reason that the government abandoned supply management. Big agribusiness corporations with well-funded lobbyists want to buy cheap commodities from farmers and sell them at a steep markup to consumers. And who's left to bear the cost? The environment, taxpayers, farmers, workers, and rural communities. As recent trade wars, the COVID-19 pandemic, and years of instability reveal cracks in our food system, grassroots support for supply management is growing across the countryside, and with good reason. Supply management can help restore the agricultural economy following a crippling global pandemic and economic downturn, just as it did after the Great Depression. Agriculture provides the food, fiber, and fuel that powers our society. It connects us to our environment and generates economic activity. Remember what thriving rural communities look like? We can have them, and supply management can help us get there. It's time to build a viable family farm economy for rural communities and all people.